With the introduction of dragon riding as a skill in Dragonflight, Blizzard appears to be seriously trying to shake up flying as players know it. Because of this, we thought now would be a great time to discuss the history of flying in World of Warcraft. From the very beginning stages of development for WoW, Blizzard knew they wanted flying to be a primary way players moved about long distances in the world. The system they eventually settled on for flying involved selecting flight masters and flight paths. The players then had no control over their character as they were whisked away across the skies in Azeroth to their selected destinations. This made the world feel both massive and complex, and was a wholly unique experience for its time. In fact, WoW essentially pioneered this mode of transportation of unlocking waypoints through flight paths and flight masters. Most players have few options to travel around the world, and this was especially true when WoW launched in 2004. Of course, Blizzard wanted to retain players' interest during these flights, and they were very well aware flying could be long and boring. So they decided to put interesting things for players to see along various flight routes in vanilla. One example of this is the Dwarven airfield outside Ironforge. Another example of this is the network of tunnels bridging wetlands and Dun Morogh. Could only be seen on scripted flight paths as well. In fact, flight routes were specifically designed around flight routes with the player's view in mind. The players wanted players to have the illusion of a massive open world that could be viewed in 360 degrees as the player flew across a zone on a predetermined flight path. Blizzard knew their game had great technical and graphical constraints, and made sure the players could only fly from one flight path to another on this specific route and nothing more. Allowing players to freely fly wherever they please would immediately ruin immersion, since early WoW was nothing but 2D textures covering up and hiding holes in maps and invisible walls, which stopped players from falling off the map. Flight masters and flight paths were also much more spread out and sparse in Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms in vanilla. In vanilla, the Alliance had 31 flight points, 14 in Kalimdor and 16 in the Eastern Kingdoms. In vanilla, the Horde had 29 flight points, 17 in Kalimdor and 12 in the Eastern Kingdoms. Of course, this isn't taking into account various other means of transportation such as zeppelins, the Deep Ran Tram, or the two boats that sail back and forth between the continents. But a total of 31 flight points for Alliance and 29 flight points for Horde in vanilla clearly shows how much bigger and vast the world was to explore in vanilla. With flying being an integral part of the game since its inception, it has become so entangled in gameplay that it's often easy to overlook. One interesting final note is that prior to 1.12, the riding skill worked as an ability rather than a profession. Using this as a starting point, we'll discuss the development of how flying has evolved over the first 9 expansions of World of Warcraft. The first time players could fly on their own mounts was in Outland with the launch of the Burning Crusade expansion. Allowing players to fly in Outland made sense both in terms of lore and for gameplay reasons. Lore-wise, Outlands is essentially a bunch of rocks floating in space. It's hard to ride ground mounts where there is no ground. In regards to gameplay, only limiting movement to the ground would make a lot of gameplay much longer, especially since a lot of Outland zones are so linear in nature. It takes over 15 minutes to get from Tempest Keep to the Black Temple by flying using a flight path. Imagine how long it would take without flying and having to account for all the verticality and various patrolling mobs as well. Adding verticality to zones also meant Blizzard could add specific areas with content which could only be accessible by max level players. The most well-known of these would be the Netherwing Drakes in the Shadowlands Valley. Flying definitely helped in getting to the Ogrilla and the Blades Edge Mountains, but it wasn't absolutely necessary to get to the Enlightened Ogres by flying to them. Upon reaching level 70 in the Burning Crusade, players could learn flying from the riding trainers. This was started by receiving a quest from Natrul, the flight master in Shattrath. To learn the flying skill, Alliance players could visit Osla Brusbrew in the Wildhammer Stronghold in Shadowlands Valley, and Horde players could visit Olrock, an orc who was also located in Shadowlands Village, which is also in Shadowlands Valley. Both of these NPCs sold 2 different levels of flying, Expert Riding and Artisan Riding. Expert Riding allowed the player to ride rare mounts at 60% movement speed on both land and in the air for 800 gold. It is important to note that even though players could fly in air with an Expert Riding, it was still far faster to travel around using Flight Masters, since Flight Masters provided a 100% increased movement speed, and rare mounts only gave a 60% speed. Artisan Riding allowed the players to ride at 100% movement speed on land and 280% speed while in the air for 5,000 gold. However, that was not all the gold the player needed to spend, since they also needed to buy the flying mounts themselves. Luckily, these mounts were not too expensive, and a rare mount cost 100 gold with an epic mount requiring 200 gold. Players also had to have previously bought both the Apprentice and Journeyman riding skills before they could buy the Expert riding skills. Flying mounts were mostly limited to Griffins for the Alliance and Wyverns for the Horde and TBC. By the end of the Burning Crusade, there were a total of 24 flying mounts, but those 6 mounts that players could buy were by far the only ones most players had. Other mounts came from raid drops, PvP gladiator mounts, and the engineering profession, to name a few. Since the Burning Crusade was designed with flying in mind, players were free to roam the skies of Outland. However, players could still not fly with their own mounts on Azeroth in the Burning Crusade. This was because of some of the technical limitations mentioned earlier, and this no-flying policy was expanded to both the Draenor and Blood Elf starting zones for another few reasons as well. The new Azeroth zones in the TBC were on an entirely different server from the original vanilla servers, and no flying also kept the immersion of a new player's or character's experience, discouraging ganking in PvP, and kept all of Azeroth's skies closed to the players. The expansion Wrath of the Lich King saw a few changes to flying. First off, the mount cast time was reduced in half from 3 seconds to 1.5 seconds in patch 3.2. Second, the expert riding skill was also reduced to 250 gold in the same patch. Wrath of the Lich King also saw the next level of flying implemented. Upon reaching level 77, players could learn cold weather flying for 1000 gold. Interestingly, there is a cold weather flying trainer in almost every zone in Northrend, with the exception of Howling Fjord, Dragonflight, and Icecrown. In total, 5 cold weather flying trainers can be found in Northrend, with 3 being neutral and 1 faction-specific trainer in the Borean Tundra. In patch 3.2, 2 more flying trainers were added, but this time in the Hellfire Peninsula and Outland. Hargan Bronzeweed was added to Honored Hold, and Jahubo was added to Thrallmar. This was the first time in the game that a player could learn flying without being at max level. At the max level of 80, a player could buy a Tome of Cold Weather Flying for 1000 gold and could mail it to any of their alts to use. They all could then learn Cold Weather Flying from the tome so long as they were level 68 or higher and had the Artisan Riding skill. These tomes could be bought from any Cold Weather Flying trainer. Several vendors who sold flying mounts were also added in Wrath of the Lich King. Notably among these vendors were My Francis and Dalaran, and the flying trainer Roxy Ramrock getting K3 in the Storm Peaks. The third and final major change to flying in Wrath was that Blizzard tried to push mounted combat hard in this expansion, to little success. While there was very minimal mounted flying combat, Blizzard did try to push it a little bit too far. There is a reason the Nexus dungeon was so often immediately deserted, and who else could forget the lovely flying disc phase of the Malagos encounter. Needless to say, the flying combat feature was not very well received in the community, and Blizzard eventually gave up on it. Although it has cropped up in scenarios and quests every now and then since Wrath, mounted flying combat has been much more of a rarity than the norm. Finally, we should briefly mention that it seems dragon riding from the Dragonflight expansion may have taken some inspirations and ideas from the mounted flying combat system in Wrath. Let's hope Blizzard learns their lesson so that dragon riding is fun and not a painful experience. Wrath of the Lich King also added achievements to the game. Among these were 4 achievements for when the player learned a new level of riding or flying. The first achievement is Giddy Up, and is earned when the player learns the Apprentice Riding skill, which gives the player riding skill of level 75. The next achievement is named Fast and Furious, and was given when the player learns a Journeyman Riding skill. This is presumably a reference to the movie franchise of the same name. The Journeyman Riding skill raises the player's riding skill to a level of 125. When players learn Expert Riding skill, and they have their riding skill increased to 225, they earn the achievement Into the Wild Blue Yonder, which is most likely a reference to the unofficial name for the official song of the United States Air Force. Expert Riding is when a player first unlocks flying mounts and can use them at 150% speed. The final flying achievement is The Right Stuff, and is earned when players learn the Artisan Riding skill and gain a riding skill of 300. This achievement's name is a reference to the 1979 book of the same name by Tom Wolfe. Next, we move on to the Cataclysm expansion. Cataclysm saw the old world completely redesigned and updated, and with these massive changes, Blizzard could update the game's graphics and assets to allow players to be able to fly in the old world without breaking the game or the player's immersion. To be able to fly in the newly revamped Kalimdor, Eastern Kingdoms, and the Elemental Plane of the Deepholm, players had to buy a Flight Master's license for 250 gold. The license had to be learned after the players bought the Master Riding skill for 5,000 gold. As of patch 4.03, almost all riding trainers offered the Master Riding skill, which increased the player's riding skill to 375 and provided flying mounts with a 310 increased speed boost while in the air. Upon learning the Master Riding skill, players earned the achievement Breaking the Sound Barrier. Flying was available at level 80, and the maximum level during Cataclysm was 85. This led to some controversy, as it allowed players at max level to easily fly and do content in the 5 new zones at Deepholm, Mount Hyjal, Twilight Highlands, Uldum, and Vashj'ir, without being max level and having leveled through all these questing contents first. From a technical perspective, it makes sense that flying would be unlocked for both continents as a whole, since they're on a huge server and almost all the new Cataclysm zones themselves are on Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms. However, Blizzard did listen to feedback, and Cataclysm remains the only expansion which allowed players to be able to immediately fly when it first launched. Of course, even today, WoW servers cannot fit all of the zones into the game onto one map, so it's no surprise some smaller zones in Cataclysm, such as Tol Barad, were limited to ground mounts. This makes sense from both a gameplay and logistics sense. A small island could easily be flown around in, and the map would feel so much smaller. Additionally, of course, Tol Barad was a mostly PvP zone, and seeing your opponent fly away during an open world battleground would not be the best feeling in the world. Finally, Tol Barad has to be phased for the battleground and reset daily for quests, both of which are hard to do in a massive open world and would break WoW's technical limitations. Another prominent example of a smaller no-fly zone from Cataclysm is the Molten Front Offensive in the Fireland. In Cataclysm, the number of flight points and flight paths increased drastically with the updates to the old world. For some numbers, the number of Alliance flight paths in Kalimdor went from 14 in Vanilla to 52 in Cataclysm, and the number of Alliance flight points in the Eastern Kingdoms went up from 16 to 69. The number of Horde flight points in Kalimdor went from 17 in Vanilla to 58 in Cataclysm, and the number of Horde flight points in Eastern Kingdoms changed from 12 to 64. It should be noted, some of these flight points can depend on your class, and the various phases of a zone's questline. There's several new zones from Cataclysm are included as well along the Seahorse flight points in Vashir, but each of these Cataclysm zones usually only added 3 or 4 more flight points per zone. Caveats aside, overall, Cataclysm added roughly 4 times the number of flight points to the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor than WoW had in vanilla. These increased flight points were not without controversy either. This added a ton of convenience, but made the world feel much smaller. Multiple flight points could now be found in every zone, whereas in vanilla, there might be 1 or even no flight points in a zone. More flight points also meant flight routes were much shorter since the player didn't have to fly further out of the way to get from one waypoint to another and could now just go in a more straight line of flight points. After all, the shortest distance between any 2 points is a direct line, at least in Euclidean geometry. One notable quest and daily quest that should be mentioned when talking about flying, and that is the Joust quest in Mount Hyjal. This quest's name is called Vigilance on Wings and can be repeated daily. For this quest, players must enter a pocket of the Firelands from Mount Hyjal and equip a lance. While flapping on this bird, the player must joust and kill 10 Twilight Lancers. This quest is notorious when first trying to do, as mechanics are really wonky and weird. This quest seems to be a leftover idea for mounted combat in Wrath, and the quest is notable for being the last quest where mounted combat was completely controlled by the player. In future expansions, Blizzard would just give the player's buttons a push while on a moving vehicle or mount, and the player would follow a predetermined path set by the quest. Also, if the player did this quest 10 times, it'd be awarded with an achievement and a pet. Finally, Cataclysm saw the introduction of some flying trainers to the faction capitals. In Stormwind, Brala Cloudwing, a Wildhammer Dwarf, was added as a flying trainer next to the flight point. Similarly, in Orgrimmar, Mazda was added as a flying trainer near the flight point between the 2 Zeppelin towers. This made learning to fly much more easier, as the player no longer had to travel to Outland or Dalaran. The next expansion is to Pandaria, and the spell to learn flying on the continent was named Wisdom of the Four Winds. Pandaria flying could be bought at level 90 for 2,500 gold. Similar to Wrath, players could also buy a Grimoire of the Four Winds and mail it to an alt so they could learn Pandarian flying. Both Wisdom of the Four Winds and the Grimoire could be bought at the faction shrine in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. Alliance players could talk to Cloudrunner Lang at the Shrine of 7 Stars to learn Pandarian flying, and Horde players could talk to Skydancer Shun at the Shrine of 2 Moons. During early MoP, players also had to learn the Cloud Serpent riding skill if they wished to ride the Cloud Serpents from the Order of the Cloud Serpent. This passive could only be learned when the player had exalted with the faction Order of the Cloud Serpent and completed the final quest associated with the faction named Riding the Skies. After completing this quest, the player could fly Cloud Serpents, but only on a character who had hit Exalted and done the capstone quest. Since Cloud Serpent riding was not account-wide, this meant you had to grind out Cloud Serpent rep on each of your individual characters if you wanted to earn it on that character. Similarly to Cataclysm, smaller patch zones and islands in MoP did not allow for riding, and these zones are the Isle of Giants, the Isle of Thunder, and the Timeless Isle. With WoW's 5th expansion, Warlords of Draenor, saw the introduction of the Pathfinder system. In order to fly in Warlords of Draenor, players had to complete the meta achievement Draenor Pathfinder. Not only was this achievement long and tedious, but it was not available until patch 6.2.2, nearly a year after WoD launch. This was by far the longest players had to wait to be able to fly an expansion up to this point. The Draenor Pathfinder consisted of 6 different achievements, with some variations for Alliance and Horde players. To be able to fly in Draenor, players had to completely explore all 6 WoD zones, complete all the bonus objectives and zone questlines, earn Revered with the 3 factions in the Tandan Jungle, and finally loot 100 treasures. Many players did not even bother to earn this achievement, even after the expansion became old content. And that's pretty much it for this infamous flying fiasco. But there are a few other flying related things that happen in Worlds of Draenor. First, the Draenor Pathfinder achievement also granted the player the Soaring Sky Terror mount. Second, there was no flight on Ashran, and the 2 main faction encampments on the 2 ends of the island also had no player flight for both gameplay and technical purposes. And finally, at the very beginning of WoD, Cloud Serpent riding from Mists of Pandaria was removed from the game. Next, we move on to the Legion expansion. Legion continued the Pathfinder achievement system, and the achievement that must be earned to fly in the Broken Isles is unsurprisingly called Broken Isles Pathfinder. There are actually 2 Broken Isles Pathfinder achievements, broken into Part 1 and Part 2. Broken Isles Pathfinder Part 1 allowed for faster riding in all the 5 main zones of the Broken Isles and was added in 7.0. Its requirements are exploring all 5 original 7.0 zones of the Broken Isles, doing all the zone questlines, doing the player's class order hall campaign, earning Revered with the 6 original factions of 7.0, and completing 100 world quests. Broken Isles Pathfinder Part 2 allowed for flying on the Broken Isles and on the Broken Shore. It was added in patch 7.2, meaning players had to wait at least 5 months before they could fly the Broken Isles. Its requirements are earning Revere with the Armage of Legionfall, exploring the Broken Shore, and completing Broken Isles Pathfinder Part 1. Flying was not permitted on Argus in patch 7.3, probably due to both gameplay and technical restrictions. Flying on Argus certainly would be very nice to have, however. All the Broken Isles can be flown in, with the exception of the Hunter and Druid order halls if the player is not of that class. Also, flying too close to Shaladrassil will cause the player to succumb to the Nightmare. Legion also saw the introduction of the Flightmaster's Whistle. Although it was locked behind achievement in a quest, it was definitely a very good quality of life upgrade before flying became available in the Broken Isles. Patch 7.2.5 also added the first scouting map heirlooms to the game. These first 4 heirloom toys could be bought each for 10,000 gold at heirloom vendors. Any character could use them to learn all the flight points and paths in the Eastern Kingdom and Kalimdor. There were 4 initially because there are 2 original continents in WoW and the 2 factions. Finally, patch 7.3.5 removed several of the old flying requirements. These included cold weather flying for flying in Northrend, the Flightmaster's license for Cataclysm Zone, and the Wisdom of the Four Winds for flying in Pandaria. Next we move on to WoW's 7th expansion, Battle for Azeroth. Like Legion, Battle for Azeroth had 2 Pathfinder achievements, with the Battle for Azeroth Pathfinder Part 1 coming in 8.0, and players could finally fly upon completing Battle for Azeroth Pathfinder Part 2, which became available in patch 8.2, nearly a year after BFA launched. Both Pathfinder requirements are almost identical to those in Legion. These tasks included having to explore these new zones, do all the zone's questlines in the war campaign, earn Revered with all the new factions, and complete 100 world quests. In patch 8.1, the flight paths for the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor were updated to be higher resolution. BFA also brought the Netomatic into the game, which is a way to dismount flying players in the air while they're in war mode. BFA also had another version of the Flightmaster's Whistle, which just allowed you to use it in BFA zones. With the Shadowlands level squish, the Pathfinder requirement to fly in both Draenor and Legion were removed. Shadowlands also infamously saw no flying in the Maw or Korthia. In patch 9.2, new scouting map heirlooms were added for all the continents and zones. Each map still cost 10,000 gold. Now that we've covered this history of WoW flying up to Shadowlands, we want to briefly discuss what problems dragon riding and Dragonflight might be trying to address. First, any player will know long flights or flight paths can be very boring. There is no player involvement other than looking around, which leads to a considerable lack of player engagement. Flight paths and long flying rides in WoW are well known as being an AFK simulator, and players often use this time as breaks to perform various other tasks in real life. Additionally, there is no player dismounting in flight paths, and players must wait until they reach the next flight master to dismount when they click the exit vehicle button. This is especially frustrating. A prime example of this is when you see a rare and fly right over it, and you have to wait to get to the nearest flight master, fly back to the rare, and find out it's already dead. Of course, Blizzard could always add more portals, waypoints, or way shrines, but that makes the actual World of Warcraft feel much smaller and overall less entertaining to a larger extent. Dragon riding makes the act of flying more harder in exchange for being faster, and it seems to solve a lot of these problems. Although you still have the option to just take a flight path if you don't want to deal with actively flying across the continent for a world quest. And that does it for this video. Keep in mind, this was a very broad overview, and we try not to go too heavy into all the details. So naturally, there are a ton of minutiae we haven't covered since flying in WoW is such a huge topic, and not all the details can be neatly compressed into a 18-minute long video. For those of you who wondered why we didn't talk about Druid flight, that's because we're saving that topic for another video, which will be all about the history of Druid's various and different shapeshifting forms. Alright, so, did we miss anything important? Let us know down in the comments below. You can also suggest topics for future videos. So, see you in the next video.